Welcome to the first video in a brand new review series that I'm doing on my channel. With this series, my aim is to carefully break down and analyze every story arc told within Bleach, starting off by introducing you to the origins of the Bleach story, as well as going over the real world and fantasy influences that are incorporated into the story. So after this brief introduction where I explain what makes Bleach a great story, we'll begin the analysis of the first story arc, which is the Substitute Shinigami arc. So join me as I'm about to begin one of my most ambitious review series on this channel, where I'm going to in detail break down and analyze every arc of Tite Kubo's work, Bleach. So definitely subscribe and turn on the bell notifications so you don't miss the latest installments in this series. And let's now get into the first part of this review. Written and illustrated by the author Tite Kubo, Bleach was a series that redefined everything that we know about action supernatural manga. After its premiere in Weekly Shonen Jump in August of 2001, Bleach heavily relies upon and incorporates the idea of the afterlife into its story, as Kubo gives us his interpretation of life after death. The story and setting incorporates real life and fantasy elements, like the environment and hierarchical structure of the Soul Society clearly being based upon feudal Japan, as well as the clothing and weaponry utilized by the Shinigami being inspired by the real-world legendary samurai of the past, as well as the ideology of one such samurai, Miyamoto Musashi, being incorporated into several characters that feature within this story. Kubo was also influenced by works from several authors that he had grown up with, most notably series like Gigigi no Kitaro, Saint Seiya, and even Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball, with him even citing in a March 2006 interview that it was Toriyama that had taught Kubo that villains need to be strong, scary and cool, with Kubo going as far as to say that the fight scene involving Trunks' first appearance being one of the most shocking and surprising story events that he had ever read within a manga. Kubo takes full advantage of the visual medium of manga in order to uniquely convey to us his story with stylistic and cool imagery, which is clearly influenced by the world of cinema. Kubo doesn't bog down his story with walls of text, instead he allows his art to speak for itself. Kubo's unique method of stylistic imagery in order to convey story is also incorporated into his method of creating characters. Kubo has stated that when he creates characters, he first designs them and then bases their personalities upon what he has drawn. This method of creating characters ensures that each character is unique from one another. Kubo has brought to life a long list of incredible characters. He usually introduces several characters at once into his story through the group dynamics that those characters fit into. If you need proof that Kubo excels at the craft of creating characters, then look no further than the captains of the Gotei 13. How each of them have their unique and distinctive personalities, and how their character designs, the accessories that they are wearing on their garments, complement their backstories, and even their motives for taking action within the story. The captains and lieutenants of the Soul Society are required to wear a set uniform, but Kubo designs into these uniforms unique modifications and alterations, which perfectly complement the personalities of each of these characters. Whether if this is Hisagi's sleeveless attire, or with Renji's equally as rebellious headband that perfectly complements his incredibly cool tattoos. The changes made to Hisagi's clothing convey to us his admiration and respect for his former captain turned Vizard Kensei, while Renji's appearance complements his rebellious hot-headed nature and is perfectly juxtaposed by the appearance of the man that he wants to surpass, Byakuya Kuchiki, who is far more calm and mellow in his appearance and personality when compared to Renji. Now that we have spoken about the author of Bleach, the influences for the story, and some of my own examples of what makes Bleach a great story, let's now dive into the analysis of the first story arc of Bleach. In this video, I'll be going over the events that take place between chapters 1 to 70, or in other words, the Substitute Shinigami arc, which is also referred to as the Death Trilogy Overture, Death and the Strawberry. It is important to note that the first 70 chapters of Bleach are adapted into the first 20 episodes of the Bleach anime. I'm going to be placing a heavy emphasis on everybody who watches these videos to check out the manga of Bleach, even from this first point that I have made, that the 20 the episodes of Bleach adapt 70 chapters of the manga, you can already assume where this is going. I want to establish from the get-go that the Bleach anime is not a perfect adaptation of Kubo's work. Not only does it remove a lot of the content within the manga, it also has a fair deal of censorship and changes that were made to the anime adaptation that do not exist within the manga. Throughout this arc analysis series, I'll go over some instances of differences between the manga and the anime, so that hopefully it inspires you to check out the source material that the anime was based upon. So for now, let's quickly go over the story that is told within this arc before we start to break down and analyze the key events that take place. The very beginning of Bleach was unique and impactful enough to leave me with a lasting impression. What made this story stand out from the plethora of shonen manga that had come before it was that it had a unique punkish style which resonated with so many teenagers and young adults across the world. This impactful first impression is all credited to the Substitute Shinigami arc, which places a heavy emphasis on character-driven stories. Through this arc, we get a solid introduction to our protagonist, as we get to understand a lot about his friends and family, his past experiences, as well as the key events that had occurred within his past, which result in him adopting the personality that he has within the first chapter of the story. During the first 3 volumes of the Bleach manga, where Ichigo's character and his past is explained to us, we are also introduced to several of Ichigo's friends, as we get a couple of excellent character-driven stories featuring Orihime and Chad, where we get to learn about their personalities, relationships with Ichigo, their beliefs about protecting others and fighting against hollows, through well-crafted character-driven stories, which set up an excellent foundation for Kubo to build upon through developing their characters within future story arcs. So in this arc, the key characters that we are introduced to are of course Ichigo, Orihime, Chad, and then the focus shifts to Uryu, Ishida. And then lastly, after Ichigo and his friends are introduced to us, we then shift our focus to the individual who had given Ichigo power. The conclusion of this arc sets up events which will lead us into the next story arc, as we turn our attention over to Rukia Kuchiki and the consequences that she must face for sharing her powers with our protagonist. As with all great stories, this arc has a solid beginning, middle and end, with the start of the arc introducing our protagonist to Rukia Kuchiki and consequently transforming him into a substitute Shinigami. During this time, we as the audience as well as Ichigo get a crash course on everything that we need to know about Shinigami, hollows and the Soul Society from Rukia herself. After Ichigo accepts the responsibility that comes along with acquiring power, we see him face off against several hollows through the story of Orihime and her older brother who transforms into the hollow Acid Wire, and then the story about Chad looking after the parakeet Yuichi Shibata, who is being tormented by the hollow Shrieker. The middle portion of this arc serves to introduce us to the character of Urahara, when Rukia ends up purchasing a mod soul from him. After the introduction of the humble candy store owner and the perverted con, we learn about the tragic death of Ichigo's mother and why he feels responsible for it. When Ichigo faces off against the hollow responsible for killing Masaki Kurosaki, Ichigo confronting and battling against the Grand Fisher was one of a handful of key events that occurred during this story arc. This portion of the story, titled Memories in the Rain, begins in chapter 18 and concludes by chapter 25. After some antics with Don Kanonji, we are then introduced to the character of Uryu Ishida, who identifies himself as a Quincy. It is through his character that we learn about the long-standing feud that exists between the Quincy and the Shinigami. The conflict between the two races exists because of the way that they exterminate hollows. Shinigami purify the hollows, sending them to the Soul Society, while Quincy exterminate the hollow, including its soul, through utilizing their Quincy arrows. Through Uryu's character, we are introduced to Ichigo's first rival within the story. After crushing a piece of hollow bait, he challenges Ichigo to a competition of who can destroy the most hollows. And when far more hollows than either of them had expected appear within Karukura town, we see Chad and Orihime caught up in Uryu's game, as Chad activates his powers against the hollow Bulbous G, while Orihime gains her abilities battling against the hollow Numb Chandelier. The candy store owner Urahara makes a reappearance during this portion of the story, as he explains the life-changing significance of gaining power to Orihime and Chad. This competition with Uryu ends after the appearance of a Menos Grande. After the two of them work together and wound the oversized opponent, they call a truce to their rivalry. And of course, the impactful end portion of this arc involves Rukia running away from Kurosaki Clinic and the arrival of Byakuya and Renji in Karukura town in order to apprehend Rukia. When Uryu fails to protect Rukia, Ichigo arrives and battles against Renji. Ichigo is initially overwhelmed by Renji, but after he gains a power boost, Renji finds it difficult to keep up with Ichigo's speed, and he does end up turning the tables on a lieutenant. As he is about to deal the finishing blow to Renji, their battle is ended by Byakuya, who stabs Ichigo through the chest. After failing to protect her, Rukia leaves with Byakuya and Renji to the Soul Society, where she must face the consequences of giving her powers to Ichigo. This arc then concludes with Ichigo, Orihime, Chad and Uryu preparing and training in order to go to the Soul Society to rescue Rukia in the next arc. Ichigo undergoes training with Urahara, where he learns to activate his innate Shinigami powers, while Chad and Orihime train with Yoruichi, and lastly Uryu trains on his own. The Substitute Shinigami arc ends in chapter 70, with Yoruichi accompanying Ichigo and the others as they travel through the Dangai to begin their journey towards the Soul Society. This summarizes all of the events that occur from the start of the first volume of Bleach to the end of the 8th volume. From chapters 1 to 70, you'll see that gradually Kubo's art has started to change. The way that he draws the faces of characters has become simplified. No longer do they have these oversized foreheads and these really angular facial proportions. As well as this, the way that Kubo draws hair has also changed. In chapter 1, Ichigo had very short and spiky hair, while in chapter 70 the hair is much longer and flowing. Another example of a character that demonstrates the growth of Kubo as an artist is the character of Orihime. In chapter 3, you can see that she has a very prominent jaw and a totally different facial structure to what we see in chapter 70. You can see that Kubo now draws a lot of his characters with more rounded features, and in my honest opinion, I love the change in Kubo's art style throughout the story, and I feel like he peaks during the Fullbring arc, where he has drawn some of the best artwork that I have seen from him. In addition to the change in how he draws characters, his paneling structure of the manga pages also changes from chapter 1 to 70. Within the first chapter, you can tell that his paneling is unrefined, and it's totally different to the work that he has done much later on. There is a lot going on in a single page, with some pages even having 8 panels on them, while in chapter 70 you can see that Kubo is more comfortable with taking up the space of the page with larger panels. He has so much more variety to his paneling, whether if this is drawing double spreads across 2 pages, or even with a page diagonally cutting through the middle, expressing his artwork through 2 impactful panels that cover an entire page. While it is true that the early portions of the Substitute Shinigami arc do feel somewhat Monster of the Week, they are all tied together thanks to the characters that are introduced and are intrinsically involved in those plot lines. This is of course in reference to Ichigo's encounter with Fishbone D, then Acid Wire, and lastly the Hollow Shrieker. They are all instances where Ichigo has to protect either his friends or his family. The encounter with Fishbone D was significant because it resulted in Ichigo gaining the power to protect, while the encounter with Acid Wire resulted in Orihime learning the identity of Ichigo as a substitute Shinigami. Later on during this arc, we learn that she didn't forget her memories of that night, and she remembers Ichigo wearing a Shinigami Shihakusho, and with the battle against the Shrieker, Chad is heavily involved. We learn about his incredible strength as an ordinary human, and how he resolves to protect the parakeet against an enemy that he cannot even see. Through Acid Wire, we learn about Orihime's bond with her brother, and through the Shrieker, we are briefly introduced to the realm of hell and to Chad's character. All of these stories are interlinked and come full circle with Orihime and Chad gaining their own powers to fight against Hollows later on during this arc. The stories that occur within this arc get longer and longer, with the encounter against Fishbone D lasting for only 1 chapter, the battle against Acid Wire lasting for 4 chapters, the fight against the Shrieker being over 5 chapters, and lastly the battle against the Grand Fisher being over 9 chapters. You can see that Kubo was becoming more and more comfortable as he started to tell longer stories involving the characters that he had just introduced, with the competition between Uryu and Ichigo and the battle against the multiple hollows that appear within Karukura town taking place between chapters 34 to 50, easily taking up a significant portion of this story arc. Another thing that I want to mention about these hollows that Ichigo and his friends were facing off against during this early portion of the story is that each of them felt like they had a variety to their abilities. Fishbone D was the first hollow that we had seen, and he demonstrated incredible strength while also possessing incredible Reiatsu, which Rukia comments upon in chapter 1 when she finally is able to sense the hollow. The next hollow, Acid Wire, was able to use its tail as a whip to attack opponents, whilst also having the ability to spit acid at its opponents. Similar to a Chinese dragon, Acid Wire was also able to fly through the air. Kubo gets really creative when it comes to the hollow Shrieker, as this hollow was able to shoot out leeches from the top of its head that can stick to anything. Once these leeches attach onto their target, the Shrieker is able to detonate them through generating vibrations from his tongue. During this arc, Kubo peaks with the introduction of the Grand Fissure, one of the most powerful hollows that Ichigo encounters. A hollow that of course possesses incredible spiritual power and enhanced speed, and has a plethora of abilities to utilize. The Grand Fissure demonstrates an ability to extend his limbs to attack his opponents. He also has tentacles that he can utilize to capture and restrain an individual. The most prominent feature of the Grand Fissure is the lore that he utilizes. This protrudes from his neck and it is used to attract potential humans that he can devour. We see the Grand Fissure utilize his lure by transforming it into Ichigo's mother, as he attempts to cause Ichigo emotional distress. In chapter 22, the Grand Fissure demonstrates an ability called Transcribe, where he extends the fingers of his claws and pierces into his opponent's body, and searches through their memories trying to find a weak spot. And it is after he does this that he transforms his lure into Ichigo's mother. In addition to all of this, the Grand Fissure also demonstrates high-speed regeneration. He is the best example of a villain that Kubo fleshes out during the Substitute Shinigami arc. Not only is the premise of this villain fascinating, his powers and abilities are also equally as fleshed out. And it is for this reason that you feel concerned for Ichigo, who is pretty much a novice here, while he is up against this very experienced hollow. This arc is supposed to give us a taster of what's to come. So many characters and concepts are introduced to us, and they are done over the course of 70 chapters. Everything from introducing characters like Urahara and Yuriichi, as well as making us aware of the realm of the Soul Society, and introducing us to the concept of Quincy's, hollows, and lastly Shinigami and the bond that they share with their Zanpakuto through learning their names, as we see Ichigo go into his inner world and confront Zangetsu, as he learns about the Shinigami powers that he has laying dormant within himself, after the powers that Rukia had given to Ichigo were removed by Byakuya. I want to now talk about some key events that occurred during this arc, the first of which is the introduction of Uryu's character. Kubo has a very distinctive manner in which he introduces characters. The best way that I can describe it is that he does so in a very cool but yet mysterious manner. Typically, the character is observing what Ichigo is doing, and there is always this air of sinister malice. You see this not only when Uryu is introduced, but even when characters like Shinji Hirako or Ginjo Kugo are introduced into the story. Through introducing Uryu's character, Kubo sets up an opposite of Ichigo. Not only is Uryu an opposite in terms of a Quincy, while Ichigo is a Shinigami, Uryu is also the more experienced fighter, while Ichigo is the novice who is new to this world. In chapter 34, Uryu is even surprised that Ichigo cannot sense the presence of a hollow. In front of both Ichigo and Rukia, Uryu summons his powers and destroys a nearby hollow. The arrow fires through the hollow like a lightning bolt, as the lore of Bleach continues to be expanded through the introduction of a Quincy. At the end of chapter 34, Uryu states to Ichigo that he hates Shinigami, and this is explained to us when we learned about Uryu's grandfather Soken Ishida, who had passed down to him the traditions of the Quincy. Uryu had developed a hatred for Shinigami after his master Soken Ishida was defeated by hollows. It was evident that the Shinigami could have arrived much sooner to save Soken Ishida, but they had purposefully been delayed in their response to help him, and this was after years of his master trying to mend the bond between Shinigami and Quincy. He had been trying his utmost best for the two groups to get along with each other, and this was despite the fact that the Shinigami had exterminated all of the Quincy in order to protect the stability of the souls between the human world and the Soul Society. After hearing about Uryu's grandfather, in chapter 46, Ichigo declares that he is going to work together with Uryu in order to defeat the hollows. Uryu initially disagrees to this notion, but he eventually changes his mind after Ichigo reveals to him that he had lost his mother to a hollow, and he explains to Uryu that he wants to protect others from experiencing such pain, the pain that he had felt when he had lost his mother, and this is what ultimately leads to the two of them working together in order to push back the threat of a Menos Grande. Upon first viewing, seeing Ichigo and Uryu work together may not be that significant, but after reading through the entirety of the story, the two of them working together in this instance is a historical moment. You can see that Urahara even recognizes this when he stops Rukia from assisting the two of them, as he emphasizes that it is an important battle for both Ichigo and Uryu to face off against this Menos Grande. After this incident, Uryu's stance within the story quickly changes, as he goes from being a rival to an ally, even going as far as to protect Rukia from the threat of Renji and Byakuya. His efforts may have been in vain, but this does lead to Ichigo arriving and protecting Uryu from being dealt a finishing blow. Up until this point, the story has been confined within the relatively small area of Karukura town, but we do know that a world exists outside of this small area, and the link between that world and Karukura town is Rukia Kuchiki. For Rukia, it was like all of the fun that she was having up until now was too good to be true, and she now has to face the music with the arrival of her childhood friend and her older brother. Through the arrival of these two characters, we get to learn a bit more about the abilities of an experienced Shinigami. Some of these abilities include enhanced speed, and most importantly, the revelation that one Zanpakuto can be released, as we get to see the Shikai release of Renji's Zanpakuto. In every sense of the word, Ichigo is completely unrefined, even with the control that he has over his spiritual pressure. Renji is as savage as a wild animal as he repeatedly attacks Ichigo, who is struggling to fend off all of his attacks. Eventually, he cuts Ichigo across the shoulder as the difference between the two of them becomes cemented, and this is where Renji explains to him the severity of the situation. Up until now, Ichigo has been fighting against hollows, but he is now up against a Shinigami who has decades of experience. Renji declares that Ichigo is as good as dead, and after he dies, his powers will be returned to Rukia, and after his defeat, Rukia will be taken back to the Soul Society where she will be executed. Rukia had run away from Kurosaki Clinic in order to protect Ichigo. She was aware of the consequences of what she had done, and she didn't want to drag Ichigo into it. After all, he was the one who had taken all of her powers. This condescending talk doesn't waver Ichigo's resolve, as he manages to swipe his Zanpakuto across Renji's face, scratching his chin. During this battle against Renji, it becomes evident that Ichigo doesn't know the name of his Zanpakuto, as Kubo introduces into his story an element to his Shinigami's power that becomes significant all the way to the end of the story. Names are a pivotal aspect to the lore of Bleach. Whether if this is calling out the name of your Zanpakuto or calling out the name of an ability, each of them have their significance, and this is explained further in detail during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, but I'll get around to that when I review that story arc. What's important to note is that the name of the Zanpakuto is first mentioned within chapter 54, and it leaves Ichigo completely confused as he has no idea what his Zanpakuto is called. And it is immediately after this instance Renji activates his Shikai, as his Zanpakuto completely transforms in shape. He strikes down Ichigo across his left shoulder, completely cutting him down. Over the course of 50 or so chapters, a meaningful bond is formed between Ichigo and Rukia. Rukia had gifted Ichigo with the power to protect his loved ones, something that he had desired ever since the death of his mother, while Ichigo had inadvertently granted Rukia with the gift of enjoying a normal life, making friends and not worrying about your duties or responsibilities. A carefree life where she would no longer have to worry about being a Shinigami or going back to the Soul Society. A life that she had enjoyed so much to the point that she felt guilty and had to force herself to run away from Kurosaki Clinic in order to protect Ichigo. It is because of the friendship that has developed between these two characters that Rukia holds Renji back from delivering the final blow to Ichigo. It is then in chapter 55 where Ichigo has a sudden burst of spiritual power. Thanks to this, he is able to turn the tide of the battle as he sweeps Renji off of his feet, knocking him to the ground. Just as Ichigo is about to declare victory against Renji, his Zanpakuto is severed clean in half by the quiet Byakuya Kuchiki, who has been doing nothing but observing this battle. Byakuya demonstrates the true difference in power between an ordinary Shinigami and a captain level Shinigami, as his incredible speed results in him appearing behind Ichigo without him even noticing, as he just as quickly stabs him through the chest. Ichigo at this moment collapses and is left with no choice but to see Rukia leave with both Byakuya and Renji. No further action will be needed against Ichigo, as he will eventually bleed out and die anyway. Just like so many other impactful scenes that occur within this manga, Kubo depicts this moment poetically, as Ichigo slowly bleeds out on the pavement with rain pouring down on him. He ends up being rescued by that humble candy store owner who always appears to be there, who is always aware of whatever is going on, but has never directly gotten involved within the story up until this point. Urahara not only heals Uryu, but he rescues Ichigo and brings him back to his store. He tells Ichigo that only he can save Rukia, and he has a method of getting him to the Soul Society, but he will only tell Ichigo this method if he promises to train with him for the next 10 days. And it is over the course of these 10 days where we are introduced to the source of Ichigo's powers, the fact that he has a dual hollow and Shinigami nature, and this is foreshadowed to us after he returns from his inner world and activates his own Shinigami powers while he is donning a mysterious hollow mask on his face. When Ichigo is sent into his inner world, he is introduced to his supposed Zanpakuto spirit, Zangetsu. This mysterious long-haired cloak-wearing individual reveals to Ichigo that his own Shinigami powers were awakened when he had borrowed Rukia's powers. It is at this moment that Ichigo is ordered to activate his own Shinigami powers by picking one box out of 1,000 falling boxes. He is to find the box that contains his Shinigami powers. After Ichigo is successful and emerges with his own Shinigami powers, he trains one-to-one with Urahara, as we learn just how powerful Urahara is. The second Shikai release of any Zanpakuto that we see within Bleach is the Zanpakuto of Urahara, as we learn the name of his Zanpakuto Zanbakudo is Benihime. During his training with Urahara, Ichigo is made to face the fear that he feels while taking part in battle. Ichigo has difficulty calling upon his Zanbakudo because his ears are plugged with fear. When Ichigo stops running away from Urahara and hesitating, he calls upon his Zanbakudo, which results in him unleashing his first Getsuga Tensho in chapter 67. After the dust settles, we see that Ichigo has actually manifested the Shikai release of his Zanbakudo. Their training ends after Ichigo unleashes a powerful Getsuga Tensho, which Urahara manages to block but still deals some damage to his hat. After this, Urahara declares that Ichigo is ready now to go to the Soul Society. While Ichigo is being trained, we do get to see some glimpses of the Soul Society, especially during chapter 65, as we see that Byakuya is confronted by Kinpachi Zaraki, who begins to taunt him. Kinpachi ends up being dragged away by Genichimaru, as we get our first glimpse of the world that Ichigo and the others are going to be going into. After Ichigo's training is completed, Ichigo has some downtime with his friends, as they get together to watch some fireworks. And of course, not too long after this, Ichigo and the others are led by Yoruichi through the Sankaimon, as they make their way through the Dangai in order to get to the Soul Society. This arc ends with a gripping cliffhanger. There are so many questions that are left unanswered. We are going into an entirely new world, which feels like Ichigo and his friends are not totally equipped to deal with. I remember when I had first read the conclusion of the Substitute Shinigami arc, I had felt doubt and fear, wondering if Ichigo and the others could really succeed in their mission with rescuing Rukia, especially after the feats that Byakuya had demonstrated, how easily he was able to cut down Ichigo. But despite this, Ichigo's resolve had given me hope, and how his resolve was able to see him through several encounters that we have seen within these 70 chapters, including his battle against the Shrieker, the Grand Fisher, even being able to successfully fend off a Menos Grande. And the most significant was his comeback against Renji, when he had turned the tide of the battle. When all hope seemed to be lost and Ichigo was about to be defeated, he was able to muster the strength to fight back. After seeing the potential that Ichigo possesses during his training with Urahara, we can see that he has so much room for growth, and this incredibly fascinating Shikai release that Renji had demonstrated, Ichigo too was quickly able to achieve. I've seen a lot of people state that the theme of the Substitute Shinigami arc is death and how to deal with it. I do agree with this slightly, but I believe that the theme of death is prevalent throughout the entirety of the Bleach story. Ichigo had to learn to deal with the death of his mother, and to come to terms with it and not to blame himself. While this goal isn't achieved within this arc, he does eventually realize this much later on. During this arc, it is also revealed that Ichigo's friends that accompany him to the Soul Society also had to face death through their own unique experiences. Whether if this was Orihime coming to terms with the death of her older brother and reminding him that she has not forgotten him, or Chad realizing that the spirit of the boy that was trapped within the parakeet has actually died, and there is no way for him to be revived back into the real world. In addition to this, Chad was born in Japan and was taken to Mexico by his parents, but at a young age they had died. We do find this out in chapter 107, but it does clarify that Chad's character also had to deal with death in his life. And lastly, the character of Uryu Ishida also had to face the pain of loss after losing his master Soken Ishida. Ichigo and his friends know all too well the pain and suffering one must endure after losing a loved one. At this point in the story, Rukia had become a cherished friend to Ichigo. He cannot stand by and let her be killed after everything that she has done. If it wasn't for her, Ichigo would not have been able to protect his family that night. If it wasn't for her, Ichigo would not have known what it feels like to have the power to protect. In chapter 58, prior to Ichigo training with Urahara, he learns that nobody else remembers Rukia, and all traces of her existence within the human world have been erased. However, it is revealed that Orihime actually remembers Rukia and asks Ichigo what had happened to her. When Ichigo explains the situation to her, he actually comes across as being doubtful as to whether if it would be the right thing to do to bring Rukia back. After all, Rukia never really belonged within the human world because she had come from the Soul Society, but it is Orihime that encourages Ichigo that it is better for Rukia to be alive in the real world rather than dying within the Soul Society. This conversation with Orihime renews Ichigo's resolve and results in Orihime contacting Chad, where they too begin their training in order to assist Ichigo. Ichigo's friends may not share in the bond that Ichigo has with Rukia, but they are willing to work hard and to help Ichigo because they are aware that if anything happens to Rukia, Ichigo would not be able to forgive himself, and it is for that reason that they don't want Ichigo to go through any pain or suffering, and they are willing to help him. In my opinion, the Substitute Shinigami arc is an excellent story arc that introduces us to the world of Bleach. You can see Kubo really get into his comfort zone and find himself as a storyteller and an artist throughout these 70 chapters that we have reviewed here. I've genuinely loved diving back into these first 70 chapters of Bleach, and every time I go through the story, without fail, I find something new to appreciate about Kubo's work, and it's made me feel even more excited to go through these Soul Society arc, the story arc that is revered as the best story arc within Bleach. My review of that story arc may be over 2 videos, because I really want to go over all of the different battles, the interactions that occur, the elements that are introduced into the story, and the impact that this arc had on the larger anime community as a whole, and why I believe that the Soul Society arc wasn't the peak of Bleach, rather it was the perfect setup for things to come. So now I hand over the discussion to all of you. What did you think about the Substitute Shinigami arc? Were there any points about this arc that I didn't mention within this video? And lastly, what are the things that you want me to talk about during my review of the Soul Society arc? I can't wait to see all of your reactions to this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again in my next Bleach review. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, then please consider supporting my channel on Patreon. I have multiple tiers with rewards including access to an exclusive Discord server, video scripts, as well as being the first to know about unreleased upcoming videos. Thank you for your time, and whatever you choose to contribute I will appreciate, and it will mean a lot to me.